Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing a review of the KV-7 from the Dreams Come True event in War Thunder. Now, the real-life KV-7 was a project by the Soviet Union circa World War II to create a self-propelled gun to go against things like lightly armored fortifications such as machine gun nests, anti-tank gun positions, and artillery precision. If the paper trail is to be believed, the project was authorized by none other than Joseph Stalin himself, and it ultimately resulted in an KV-1 chassis that essentially has the top cut off and replaced with a casemate mounting a single 76mm and two 45mm. The combination of three guns could be fired either individually or as a single powerful salvo. Ultimately, this rather unusual gun mounting system proved to be the downfall of the KV-7, as the Soviet army was not really satisfied with either the accuracy or rate of fire of the cannons in this mounting system. Ultimately, the project was cancelled with only one prototype built, and this also brings up a rather interesting point. In the game of War Thunder, the KV-7 is referred to KV-7 U-13. U-13 is the 13th model of vehicle produced by the Ural tank plant. There are actually multiple other proposed and even one other built KV-7, and the fact that they preemptively named it U-13 might actually mean that we have another one coming on the way, possibly U-14, which instead of this gun mounting actually used a double 76 mounting. Now, before we get started looking at the KV-7 proper and its role in War Thunder, I would like to give a special shout out to the game mode to earn the IS-7, or at least tickets to potentially get in a raffle for the IS-7 that Gaijin launched shortly after the KV-7 was released. In this game mode, you had to play KV-7s in an arcade game mode against whole teams of other KV-7s. This was a fairly abysmal experience, as everybody is simply aiming for absolutely tiny weak points and frequently missing. As long as you kept your tank moving, you were borderline invincible unless somebody got particularly lucky. Even though it was an arcade game mode and you could see the pin indicator was at best very inconsistent, and this ultimately resulted in a fairly tedious game mode, especially as the 45s were borderline useless on almost every part of the KV. So I'd like to give a special shout out for how unbelievably tedious and annoying this experience was. Moving on to the KV-7 itself and how it generally functions in the game, the overall mobility of the KV-7 is fairly modest, or at least if you're used to other Soviet tanks of this battle rating, it will feel very comparable. Since the hull of the KV-7 is identical to the KV-1 and KV-1S, as is the engine, you can expect fairly similar performance, although the KV-7 is noticeably heavier, and this is similar performance across the board. It doesn't have access to neutral steer, it only has access to pivot steer, which is kind of annoying because this one is a casemate, whereas the other two are turreted vehicles. Additionally, the reverse gear of only 6 kph is more painful when you don't have a turret, because obviously having to swing the entire tank around to confront somebody who is potentially behind you becomes a lot more annoying in something like the KV-7. With all that being said, however, the general cruising speed of around 30 kph is not that hard to get up to, and while it is heavier than the other two, the KV-1 and the KV-1S, it's not significantly heavier, so you are generally at about the same level in terms of overall forward mobility, so you can at least get into useful positions relatively easily. While the mobility of the KV-7 in a vacuum seems perfectly acceptable, especially for a vehicle around 4.0, the biggest downside really is that it's a casemate with very limited traverse angles, and what this ultimately means is that while it can generally move around reasonably well, the fact that you have to spin your entire tank to be able to shoot at a target makes a lot of the more annoying aspects of Soviet mobility that much more frustrating to deal with. While Soviet vehicles can on the whole be a little awkward to handle at the best of times, most of them at least have turrets, and this one doesn't, and this puts it in a whole other category of annoying above and beyond its brothers and sisters. To put it simply, there's a valid reason why a lot of the Soviet casemate tank destroyers just keep going down in battle rating, because they're just so awkward to use compared to contemporary casemates, especially the German ones like the Stug 3G or the Panzer 470. As far as the overall armor and protection of the KV-7, it's reasonably sound all around with some notable exceptions. The side armor is relatively thick, so this vehicle can angle reasonably well like a normal KV-1 or even like something like a Tiger. As long as you're keeping the vehicle angling and keeping it moving, its relatively small weak points can often be quite difficult to pick out or hit. And this is especially frustrating as a lot of vehicles this battle rating only have around 100mm of penetration, and the average armor of the KV-7 is anywhere from 70 to 100mm depending on where you're shooting at it. However, it's not all sunshine and roses for the armor of the KV-7. The biggest problem of the KV-7 is, yet again, that it's a casemate. Because it's a casemate and you have to aim your entire gun at the enemy, you can't really angle as efficiently as you can with a regular KV-1 or even a KV-1S. This is also compounded by the fact that the face of the casemate is perfectly flat, so any round with enough penetration is essentially guaranteed to go through while you are still swinging your gun on target, and this is especially true if you have to fight the German guns. The Panzer IVs with the Long 75 in particular, and vehicles like the Panzer 470 and the Stug 3G will all just chew you to pieces before you even get your gun on target. To top it off, other common enemies you fight are things like the Shermans with their stabilized 75, and while they can't just click on any part of the tank, if they do know where to click, they can probably click on you before you can click on them, and their armor is just trolly enough that you can't generally aim center mass unless you see them broadside. All of these factors combined mean the armor is noticeably worse than it looks like on paper. If you look at a vehicle like the Tiger, it's easy to mistake the Tiger's armor for not being that great because you can simply look at it in the armor viewer. However, a Tiger player that's somewhat good at the game and is also moving and keeping their armor angled at all times can make their armor a very frustrating target for things like the 76 and the 85. Vehicles like the KV-7, however, their armor is actually worse than it appears on paper just because it's so awkward to swing the gun on target, and you have those big flat plates that the enemy can basically always shoot at if you're aiming your gun at them. To compound all of this, the KV-7 is absolutely filled with ammunition, and while it does go up one crew member all the way up to 6, all of the crew members are now in a relatively confined space that's actually a lot easier to one-shot by hitting things like the driver's port or the front of the casemate. So the KV-7 tends to get crippled or killed a lot more easily than the KV-1s. On the whole, my experience with the KV-7's armor is that it's actually deceptively bad. It's noticeably worse in practice than it looks like it would be in theory, just because of how restrictive the gun arc is and how flat that frontal casemate is, and additionally how cramped the interior is in terms of crew and ammunition. Moving on to one of the more unique aspects of the KV-7, and that is the firepower. You have two 45mm cannons flanking a 76mm cannon in the center. Now of note here, the game essentially treats the 76mm as your main gun and the dual 45s as your secondary, so you will fire both 45s at once and you have to have the same ammunition loaded in both 45s. Of course, looking at the ammo selection for the 45s, it's pretty slim pickings. You have a solid shot AP round that isn't really any better than the APHE round. You lose a whopping 3mm of flat penetration at point blank range, which isn't really going to be enough to make the difference, and in exchange the APHE round does noticeably more damage. You also have an APCR round. The APCR round seems like it would have better penetration in theory, however a paradox with the APCR round both on the 45 and the 76 is if a target is heavily armored enough that you can't pen it with your normal APHE round, switching to the APCR round is probably going to mean you're doing essentially no damage, because APCR does damage based on the amount of residual penetration it has when it passes through the armor. This paradox where the heavily armored targets the APCR doesn't really do damage to is not really unique to the KV-7, but it is also one of the reasons why it's often not even worth loading it in your inventory. Of note, the 45s do not have any high explosive rounds, and you can't load one gun with APHE and one gun with high explosive even if it did, which would be fairly handy for some of the open top vehicles at this battle rating, but you can't really do it, so it's not worth discussing that much. Moving on to the 76mm, and this is essentially your primary gun, and your primary ammunition is almost certainly going to be the BR350B MD8 fuse. There is a slightly worse APHE, but this is more for completion's sake. You're obviously not grinding ammunition or modifications because this is not a tech tree vehicle, it's a premium vehicle, so you really never need to even bother using the other APHE round. We already discussed that the APCR rounds on the 45 are questionably useful, and the APCR rounds on the 76 are equally questionably useful. Even in the game mode where you're fighting other KV-7s and it should theoretically pen more reliably on the frontal casemate, it still was struggling to really do any meaningful damage, so I have a hard time recommending even taking any of those out. The KV-7 also has 3 situational rounds. You have a shrapnel round, which is probably not worth taking. It only has a maximum pen of 35mm. It's essentially an APHE round with slightly more explosive filler but slightly less penetration. However, it's pretty uncommon that this will do the job, however your main APHE round won't, so I wouldn't really recommend taking it. The next one is the high explosive explosive round, which has a maximum pen of 10 millimeters. It's okay, it's not great. However, you do have a heat round that has a maximum penetration of 80 millimeters, and to top it off, typically the overpressure on heat rounds is around 10 to 15 millimeters anyway, so it kind of doubles as a high explosive round in that regards, and I would broadly recommend just taking this and not really bothering with a high explosive round, as in most situations this will do the job just as good if not better. Of course, evaluating the firepower, and we're going back to the same common thread, the biggest drawback to this firepower is that it is mounted in a casemate. Having to swing the entire tank to get all 3 guns on target is fairly tedious, and the guns themselves have a very weak traverse arc of only about 7 degrees left or right, and this means you have to be even more precise with your maneuvering than normal. On top of that, the traverse speed and the elevation speed are incredibly poor, so even if you can swing the tank to point almost directly at the target, getting that final little bit of extra correction takes enough time that the enemy might just snap a shot to your perfectly flat casemate and take you out anyway. In practice, I also found the 45s added very little to the experience, as there weren't a ton of situations where the 76 had such a slow reload that I needed the 45s, and even in scenarios where I used them, they didn't feel terrifically accurate and weren't that useful unless I was doing side shots, and if I was doing side shots, I typically didn't need the rapid fire of the 45s anyway. If I were to compare this small gun big gun arrangement to another vehicle such as the American M6 heavy tank, the M6 is stabilized and also turreted, so the 37mm can actually come in handy when dealing with light vehicles like Pumas or even things like Panzer IVs that you can see from the side, and this allows the vehicle to generally stay aggressive and keep a gun loaded at all times. The problem with the KV-7 is you almost need a more sedentary playstyle to compensate for the fact that you don't have a turret and you're not the most reactive vehicle in the world, and none of this works well in conjunction with the fact that if you do try to be aggressive and rush up on people, your casemate is going to be incredibly vulnerable while you're trying to get that last little bit of correction to get your guns on target. So I guess it's about time to give my closing thoughts, and I don't think it's going to come as much of a shock to anyone that I didn't really care for this vehicle. Turning the KV-1 into a casemate and adding 2 weaker guns really isn't much of an upgrade in the vast majority of scenarios. In fact, the fact that you're making it a casemate and making it heavier is a pretty massive downside, and simply adding 2 smaller guns doesn't really compensate for it. The only advantage this has over its contemporary heavy tanks like the KV-1 and KV-1S is that as a tank destroyer it is noticeably cheaper to spawn. Heavy tanks are some of the most expensive vehicles to spawn and have no other class abilities, whereas tank destroyers tend to be the cheapest vehicle to spawn and have no class abilities. So really the only advantage of this vehicle is that you can take it out even if you're very low on spawn points, but even then, because it requires a more sedentary or thoughtful playstyle, it's not necessarily the best to spawn late in the map if you're not doing particularly well, because it's a lot more restrictive in terms of what you can do with it. None of this was helped by the fact that the German Long 75 goes clean through the casemate at basically any range and any angle, and the casemate is exceptionally flat, so this was happening basically all the time while I was desperately trying to swing my vehicle around and get the really slow traverse and elevation speeds to cooperate. Even vehicles like the American Shermans that aren't anywhere near as much of a lull pen against the KV-7 could still easily pick out weak points with their incredibly responsive guns, such as the driver's port, the lower front plate, and even the parts of the casemate that are obviously weaker because they don't have the extra plate welded on top. Ultimately, the KV-7 is a vehicle that looks somewhat interesting and competent on paper, but in practice none of it really comes together in the game, and ultimately the vehicle is just found wanting in basically every area in my opinion. Of course, that's just my opinion on the matter. Feel free to let me know down in the comments down below if you love the KV-7, hate the KV-7, or you just feel it's an okay tank. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, don't give it to shoes.